Why we for slumber, America, land of brave and true, with castles and clothing and food for all belong to you. Every man a king, every man a king, for you can be a millionaire. But there's nothing belonging to others, there's enough for all people to share. When it's sunny June and December.
Hello and welcome to the Backtrack Podcast. Today we're going to be doing a little bit more of an interview style episode, I guess. So we're going to be talking about fascism today. We're going to be correcting the record. In the defense of fascism, I guess we have Seamus from the Seamusite Fascisti and the leader, the coalition leader of the Fascisti coalition. Seamus is also a historian. Welcome, Seamus.
Well, thank you very much.
Fantastic. Let's get right into it. So let's talk a little bit about fascism. So how would you describe fascism simply?
It's not really something that can easily be described simply, right? That's where a lot of the misconception of what fascism arises from, is from people trying to boil it down to just a handful of terms at most, right? Which is damaging to the ideology, as it is to any ideology, to value it to just a simple collection of words. But the easiest way to bring it down to, I don't know, a couple sentence length would be probably a corporatism with national syndicalist ideals as explained by Sorel. Of course, by adding in the effects of Gentile and the Hegelian philosophy that he brought about with him. And that sort of coalitions together and collides in to form the body, the philosophy, and the mindset of organization in fascism. Constructing a conception of state, right, and the state itself around the idea of a corpus as corporatism is explained.
Alrighty. Sorry. Can chat say, is my mic better now? I think my mic is better now. I think I turned it up a little bit, so hopefully that's better. Is it better?
I'm not noticing any difficulties here.
No. I'm just because on YouTube it will be a little bit different because I can control how loud it is on there from my stream. Okay, fantastic. Anyway, let's continue. So let's get a little more into the I guess the meat of things. So let's talk about I guess the elephant in the room. So oftentimes Nazism and fascism are conflated to be the same thing or being at least similar things based off of similar philosophy. Let's discuss that, I guess. So what do you say to people who conflate fascism and Nazism together?
Well, the people who do have been the victim of a systemic Western propaganda. Places, and also Eastern for some part, the USSR did its own share. Georgy Dimitrov in Bulgaria, I think it was his proclamation in 1951 that truly built the mindset that Nazism and fascism were two ideologies of the same brand, when he stated that the totalitarian regimes of Italy and Germany were one but the same, in a very controversial speech to a few Bulgarian Stalinists shortly after the war had ended and, of course, the Cold War had begun. And this kind of propaganda held on all the way to the modern day, with this conception that fascism has somehow always been connected to National Socialism. But this can be differentiated in a few ways. First of all, we can look at the origins of fascism and National Socialism. We can look at the philosophy of National Socialism and of course, the philosophy of fascism. And then we can also compare the two stances on policy and their actions, or praxis, as it would be called, of implementation of ideals, of course. So if we break it down one by one, its origins, separate. Fascism traces its earliest origins probably to the Proudhon Circle in 1911, led by George Sorel and the others, which actually gave birth to one of the most notable French fascists, Georges Valois of the French Fascistes. That was sort of the core inspiration behind what would later become fascism. And in fact, Mussolini, in a speech, which is undated for some reason, I've never been able to find a date for it, did state at one point that he owed everything he had to Sorel, which is an interesting point to take. And then, of course, we can look at the origins of National Socialism, which trace back to 1906 and the formation of the Austrian German Workers' Party, or the DAP/A, which was founded out of the remains of the Austrian anti-Semite party. People like George von Richter and whatnot, who had their followers call him the Führer and salute him with a three-fingered salute held at eye level. Shows a lot of similarities between that and what would later become Nazi iconography icons, right? And in fact, Hitler does cite these men of the Austrian anti-Semite party in the early DAP as his influences, more so than he ever cited Mussolini. And of course, the ideologies never actually conflated into one, even in 1938, when the famous Italian racial laws came into effect. In fact, Mussolini stated to the effect that the racial laws were only to appease Hitler at a time where Hitler was growing rapidly and unstoppably. If we look at philosophy, the conceptualization of state and the philosophy of life are entirely different. The Nazis only cared about race and the expansion of their racial lands, Lebensraum, right? Where they wanted lands of which would be justifiably conquered in their mindset in order to house the Aryan Germanic peoples and expand their wealth and ability. This philosophy, this mindset, originates from Nietzsche's Über and Untermensch, right? Which the Nazis entirely misrepresented by claiming that Aryans were the Über, or the Übermensch, while everybody else was an Untermensch, a lesser person. Fascism's philosophy does not stem from Nietzsche, though we do take lessons from Nietzsche's claims about the death of God and so forth. It comes from Hegel and the philosophers before, which is who Gentile and Sorel both claim that most of their influence being from is Hegel. And personally, I feel that Thomas Hobbes in his book Leviathan do have a large pull on the philosophy of life and absolutism and authority in the fascist state, which is the conceptualization, of course. And of course, in order to see the fascist state, the differences, it most simplified, I think, in my article, or one of the articles of my fascists, explains that if you put the gun to the head of a Nazi and the gun to the head of a fascist, and ask them what he would choose between his race or his nation, they would answer the complete opposite. That is the simple boiling down of that. And of course, we can look at the praxis. The Nazis were crony capitalists. As a
Well,
survey,
actually, we'll talk about the economy later.
Okay, we'll get on the economy later.
Fantastic. So then let's go a little bit more in depth to something you kind of mentioned. So why then would it be misrepresented in such a way that has led to such a degradation of seemingly at least half decent ideology?
So the fear was that due to its ability to stir up the people into such a nationalist and caring frenzy that they would justifiably care about nothing but the nation and the well-being of the nation itself. That kind of mindset and the ability for them to crack down so staunchly on the capitalists while also keeping communism from taking power really scared the upper classes of most Western nations. And their anti-communist and anti-socialist stance, of course, scared the nations of the East, who had preferred the ideals of Marx and Lenin over the ideals of Giovanni Gentile and whatnot, right? So when we look at these reasonings behind why they became so heavily hated, it's mostly, almost entirely due to the ability of propaganda over the course of multiple generations, of which it was boiled into your head, it was beat into you, that fascism was bad, that fascism was a dictatorial power, that fascism was evil, that it would do horrible things to you, and you would do nothing to stop it, right? So you had to fight fascism with every inch of your body in order to prevent it from hurting you like it had hurt the Italians, or, they always conveniently leave out Spain, Portugal, Argentina, Austria, Slovakia, all these nations who prospered under fascism and had no issues with the fascist regimes and still don't to this very day, right? They leave out these nations because they are good examples of what fascism can do for a country. And they leave these out keelly so that they can attack the failed Italian state after it was invaded, and of course that with Hitler, and and it can compare that to the Nazis because of its siding, right? That is where the ideal became poisoned by the West.
Fantastic. So, and I guess this is something that's often mentioned. So oftentimes, at least in Western countries, it tends to be called, or it tends to be described as, or fascism tends to be described as having to have one in-group and one out-group. Can you elaborate on why that's not true, or why that is true?
Sure. What they confuse this is some kind of populist trait, right? Because a lot of populism relies on there being something for people to fear, something for people to want to get away from, be it immigrants, be it Jews, be it whatever, that causes this kind of ire for the people, enough so that a populist leader can stir up this kind of hatred for them. Fascism has never required that level of hate. Mussolini wasn't going up on the stage and declaring that the Jews, the blacks, all these people were coming to take Italian jobs, or that they were attacking the Italian way of life through the banks. Now, what he was claiming was that Italy was failing due to its own ability. The Italians had given up by electing the democratic regimes, by pushing the liberalized capitalist ideals, and not standing up against the socialist violence. Right? He didn't hate people per se. He showed people that through a new lens that Italy could be led into a better world, a better life. So it does not require an in-group or an out-group whatsoever in order to curate this air of fascism, to create the fascist state in earnest.
Okay, fantastic. So let's talk about anti-Semitism. Is fascism anti-Semitism, and what are your takes as a fascist on anti-Semitism, and historical takes on
Sure,
anti-Semitism?
sure. Now, anti-Semitism has always come as a very gotcha kind of take from the people who have this distaste for fascism, anti-fascists, whatever you want to call them, right? The reasoning for this is that they try to use Hitler and late Mussolini as examples of there being hate against Jews. I reject this message completely because it's false. It's empirically false. We can look at the praxis. We can look at the effect that Mussolini was in fact hiding Jews, claiming that they were converted to Christians or that they were never Jews at all, and hiding them in southern Italy. We can look at the fact that most of his staff, his upper staff, including his secretary and a few of his cabinet members, were actually Jews. We can look at those are just anecdotes, right? But we can also look at the fact that in 1945, in his final days, the last people who visited him were the leader of the Italian Council of Jews, who claimed that the Jews were still behind Mussolini. And then this kind of thing, this kind of relationship between fascism and the Jews, has been a long-standing thing. The Lehi, an organization for Israeli independence, first and foremost approached Mussolini. Right, they were the first. The first thing they did was approach Mussolini and get him to support their endeavor for a free Israel under the leadership of Abraham Stern, who was formerly, as a Jew, a member of an Italian university and a member of the fascist university groups. So fascism has never had any kind of hatred for Jews. And in fact, Mussolini has been quoted on several occasions, bringing up the fact that anti-Semitism, that racialism, that all of this kind of thing had no place in the fascist state. It was unnecessary and, in fact, damaging to any kind of political view that could be held by a fascist. He stated that there is no place for anti-Semitism in Italy, and there never has been. When things go awry in Germany, the Jews are blamed for it. Right? He said that the national pride has no delirium of the issues of anti-Semitism or race. He stated that I hold no special love for the Jews at one point in 1938. He said, I have no special love for the Jews, but I do not believe the Jews should in any way be persecuted by the state. That is an incorrect and horrific way to work. That is a quote from Mussolini. This is the kind of proof that we have that Mussolini never held ill will towards the Jews, and neither did any of the fascists. Franco, Salazar, Peron, Engelbert Dollfuss, Kurt Schaufelnegg, Joseph Tiso, even though he was basically a Nazi puppet, Joseph Tiso did his work to try and convert Jews into Roman Catholicism, or quote-unquote convert them, in order to hide them from SS authorities when they would come through. And all these people did work in order to protect their national Jews and protect the Jews from the scourge of the Nazis. They did their work, right? And this is that's been completely ignored. That entire portion of history has been completely wiped out by Western propaganda and Eastern propaganda, of course, in order to build up this hatred of fascism and to scare Jews, to scare Semites in general, of the idea of fascism as if it was going to come and hurt them.
Okay, fantastic. So let me see what's my next question here. So I guess we'll go on to the racism and that sort of thing. So what do you have to say to people who say that Mussolini was a racist? He had racist views towards the Slavic people, and let's also talk about the manifesto of race and how that affected the relations of fascism at the time.
Sure. The manifesto of race, it gets a lot of attention, right? Because it was a very racist document, of course. It was the explicit thing that fascism had always seemed to oppose. At the 1934 Montreux Conference and the 1935 Montreux Conference in France, both times, all of the fascist parties in Europe had agreed to systematically deny and renounce any kind of attachments to anti-Semitism, to racialism, to anything of the like. Even the Romanian Iron Guard, which is famed for some really close to anti-Semitic comments, such as Jews being the earned sin of the nation. It was a very religious movement, of course, so it viewed, at the time, the consensus among Orthodox scholars was that Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus and thus could never be freed of that basic sin, right? But even the most religious fanatics, the clerical fascists of Romania under the Iron Guard, believed that Jews should not be harmed, right? Which is insane, right? Even in everything from My Legionaries, Codrano explains that although the Jews may be the enemy of Christendom, they are not the enemy of the Romanian as long as they assimilate, as long as they become Romanians themselves, right? which is the basic idea of all fascists, that any peoples, Jewish, not Jewish, European even, must assimilate to the same culture as the nation of the home, right? Correct. But no ill will was to come towards those Jews. And the same thing with the fellow races, blacks, Asians, etc. No harm was to come of these people, because they were, as the ideals of Mussolini and Giovanni Gentile, Sorel, and so forth go on, were a part of the fascist system, regardless of their color, their creed, whatever it was. And Mussolini, despite his comments on Slavs, which yes, he did in fact say that the Slavs were bad people, but people leave out that he wasn't talking about all Slavs. He was talking about Yugoslavs, as in the neighbors to Italy who had, in his mindset, unjustly occupied rightful Italian lands filled with Italians, right? So he viewed the illegal occupation of those lands in 1921 as a threat to the Italian lives who lived there, because the Yugoslavians' identity and their stated governmental goal was to create a state for only Slavs, right? So Italians were not Slavs. So what he was doing when he was speaking in 1921 about the removal of Slavs from rightfully Italian lands was systemic deportation at the worst. He was not talking about harming any Slavs, and he was not talking about how Slavs were inferior. All he stated was that Slavs were illegally occupying Italian lands. And he reneged these statements later on in the 1930s when he talked about Yugoslavia again. By then, the tensions had cooled, land had been agreed upon, etc. And so when discussions came up again about the Slavs, he had discussed how the Slavs were no longer the enemy of Italy, no longer the enemy of the Italian people, that they were just another neighbor, right? So the idea that he was some kind of racialist in disguise, hiding behind all these good comments and whatnot, is absolutely ludicrous.
Okay, fantastic.
I mean, just look at his action.
No, I'm gonna pause our interview here for a second. So, if you do want to see any of his sources, I'm pretty sure you can find them. I think I have them in below.
In the description.
I believe they are in the library, the Seamusite library, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. So you can find those there if you are looking for sources for all this stuff, because I'm aware that it's going to be a hard thing for a lot of people to kind of hear and understand this kind of thing, because you're told so much stuff about fascism. So it is in the description. You can check all this stuff out. It will be listed there, and his website's there as well. My website there is there as well. Fantastic. Let's get moving right on. So let's talk about like some of the bad fascists. Let's talk about Pinochet and some of the fascists that were inserted.
Pinochet wasn't a fascist. He was a national capitalist. He wanted to privatize everything. It was generally a mess with Pinochet. Do you mean Perón in Argentina? Although I wouldn't characterize him as a quote-unquote bad fascist. His work is.
I'm talking more about people who.
Misconceptualized.
Are kind of represented as fascists. Like for example, Pinochet was represented as a fascist leader that the U.S. inserted into that situation. Let's talk more about that kind of character. Let's talk kind of what do you think about those, and how do they kind of fit into the fascist, or not? How do they not fit into the fascist ideology? It's about Hitler well.
Here's an interesting few things, right? Pinochet, although he is claimed to be a fascist because he's an authoritarian, he was a nationalist, etc. What he did in effect was privatization, mass privatization of most industries, which is directly against the fascist ideals of economics, etc. He was also outwardly violent towards his people. I mean, I've talked extensively about how many people Mussolini had killed in his 20 years of regime. 17 people were killed by the Italian Orva. All of them had rightful reasons to die. Either they were pedophiles, mobsters, or murderers, right, who deserved their fate at the end of the noose. Pinochet would kill random communists, people who were generally associated with the Communist Party. He even killed fascists at some point, the Falangists, and in Chile suffered extensively under Pinochet. So the people like him, you can compare him to Batista in Cuba. You can compare him to the people in Peru, El Salvador, etc. The people who America had put in there, although they're called fascists because they were authoritarian, they almost certainly were not. And in fact, they were most of the time, some of the times at least, they were overthrown by fascists, such as Che Guevara, who wasn't a fascist, but learned from fascism in his early days, and of course Fidel Castro, who was a Falangist, and quite open about his Falangist sentiments and his Falangist history. So the idea that fascism had been implemented in these Latin American countries and had been so used in order to suppress the communistic ideals down there is completely false. And I would argue even that most of the quote-unquote communists of South America and the Latin American countries were in fact most likely more influenced by Falangism than communism, and simply used the communist name in order to bait China and the USSR into giving them aid.
Okay, fantastic. So let's talk about fascist Italy. So oftentimes, at least in the West, we told often that fascism requires the purging of political enemies and political dissidents. Did Mussolini do that? And if he did not, then why is it represented as such that is an ideal
Sure,
of fascism?
sure. So I like to refer to the communists themselves in this point. The claim is that the claim is that suddenly fascism was imprisoning people, was oppressing people. In its 20 years of reign, the Orva arrested exactly 4,000 people, according to the Orva records, of course, which were recovered from Rome in 1943. And of those 4,000 people, only about 2,000 or half of them actually remained in a quote unquote prisonary efficiency, right? But what these people were arrested for is a good question. These people were arrested for revolutionary activities. Now, these people were not punished per se. They were not put in a cinder block prison. They were not locked behind bars, and they were not put in a camp either. What they were doing, according to Bordinga, a very well-known left communist, of course, you may know his name, he was put on a beautiful island named Ponza, in which he built houses with his fellow Italian communists, and he said he loved it. And personally, he thanked Mussolini for this kind of opportunity to grow and think in private without the constraints of politics and the fear of any kind of repression. He was removed, right? He was put on this beautiful little island, which right now is a tourist attraction, and it was just it's a great little area. Of course, if you want to go to Ponza, it's apparently a really great vacation spot. Beautiful beaches by the pictures I've seen. And similar islands to this all around the coast of Italy. Now they were put there and they were given exactly 5 lira or 6 lira per day, or about 1 USD, in order to buy food. I've talked extensively about how the price of food is, and I'm pretty sure you want to get into that when we talk about economics. So I'll leave that for now. But these people were not hurt in their time in these prisons. Bordinga described it as comfy. Nicolai Bombisi, the leader of the Italian Communist Party and fervent supporter of Mussolini, said that these camps were beyond prison and in fact were basically retirement homes for former politicians, right? So these places were not places of harm. And the vast majority of the people who went there said they enjoyed them. And when they came back to Italy, they wrote extensively, and especially in Bordinga's place, about how anti-fascism was a lie. Bordinga actually wrote a full article discussing how the Axis under Italy should have won World War II after the war, which I find quite interesting, and I can send it to anybody who wants to read it. And he talked extensively about how Italy should have won the war and how Mussolini was a great man. And that's pretty extreme for somebody who is, by most, considered a very radical left communist, right? And a very big influence on some of the modern day communists that you'll meet.
Okay, well, I mean, you did mention Antifa there, and I was gonna go to that a little bit later, but we can go to that now actually. So, Antifa, what are your thoughts on them? I mean, I'm assuming you've run into them, and so how do you think that? What do you think about the anti-fascist behavior and in their rhetoric and
Sure
their
thing.
practice?
The anti-fascist is inherently a reactionary, no matter what his politics may be, socialist, etc., liberal, fucking sock them, it does not matter. They are a reactionary. They are a direct reaction to fascism and the fascist ideals. So when we move from that point, we can look at how anti-fascism has actually gone. It has never succeeded. Anti-fascism has always been an assault on usually peaceful fascists. Look at Cable Street. Look at the British fascists, the Irish fascists, the French fascists, etc. It would attack these people because they weren't sure how to debate them. They couldn't beat them in actual debate. In fact, Urza Pound, in his book Jefferson and or Mussolini, which is on our website, by the way, um, in his discussion on the similarities between Jefferson and Mussolini, he talks about his time in Italy, where he, in 1936, meets this fervent anti-fascist in the chambers, of which Mussolini is having an interesting debate with. And now Urza Pound cuts in, and he goes, "Excuse me, sir, excuse me," after the man had just finished his recent speech. And the man goes, "Yes." And Urza Pound, according to his own account, goes, "What about the economy?" And the anti-fascist stands there for a moment, flabbergasted, unsure what to say, and then finally responds, "Well, I wouldn't know about that," before sitting back down. And that is a good perspective of what an anti-fascist is. They only oppose fascists because of what they've been lied about, right? They don't actually know the truth, the praxis, the theory of fascism, and instead they have this immortalized idea that somehow the Western propaganda that they've been fed, and they hate it for that. So they combat it wherever they find it.
Okay, fantastic. So let me ask you a question that I kind of was gonna ask you. So if anti-fascists were instead anti-Nazis, would you then support them?
I mean, of course, any kind of operation that opposes National Socialism is one of merit. I mean, even if it's run by the most centrist liberal people or even conservative or whatever, doesn't matter, right? They are opposing an ideology that is fundamentally built upon the pillars of hate, upon the pillars of fear, an ideology that only leads people to ruin, right? So I do not back National Socialism. I do not back the ideal of National Socialism, and I oppose National Socialism where I find it. And I try to debate National Socialists. I try to bring arguments to them to show them of their incorrect point of view. I do my best to combat National Socialism where I find it. However, I don't believe that any organization should be founded in just the effort of stopping an ideology. I believe that is wrong. It's not a way to work, right? Because your ideology will only be based around combating that ideology, and thus, when that ideology may be defeated, if ever, if it can be even, depending on your view on how ideologies work, then the only effort of you remaining would bring them back into existence, which is, I view, is why National Socialism, white supremacy, white identitarianism, etc., are coming back in the modern day, because anti-fascism and etc. has shifted from being an intellectualist movement or an anti-intellectualist movement, depending on how you view it, towards just being a anti-white or anti-conservative movement in general, which seems to be damaging to their own goal of combating National Socialism or fascism or whatever they want to combat at this point, right? It seems to diverge them from their original point of view.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Oftentimes, Donald Trump, the previous president, is often referred to now as a fascist. What would you have to say to people who would call Donald Trump a fascist?
I mean, I don't understand it. Of course, Donald Trump was somewhat authoritarian. I mean, I guess that's the basis for calling people fascist nowadays. But at the time, that is the nowadays. But I don't. He doesn't have any kind of fascist praxis or any kind of fascist holdups. Like, he was slightly anti-immigration, which I guess you could attribute to perhaps leading towards a fascist view in immigration, which isn't total stoppages, but more of a meritocratic system of bringing people in. But I mean, even then, he didn't have any plan for actually how he was going to sort out that immigration issue, and all he did was want to stop people from coming in. So even in immigration, he isn't comparable to a fascist plan. And it's kind of ridiculous that any kind of political theorist worth his salt would ever try to compare what is a populist, maybe moderate conservatism to fascism, which is nothing.
Yeah, I would generally consider him a right wing populist, or even at very most a paleoconservative. Even then, he's not as religious as a paleoconservative would probably present themselves. Well, actually, it's good. It's a good segue. So, what is the fascist take on religion?
Well, Mussolini and many others had discussed religion a lot. And I believe each fascist state to their own on deciding the religious question, of course. But from a pan-fascismo point of view, which is what I try to establish with the Seamusite Fascisti, if you didn't know, it was a rebirth of the CAUR, the Committee Actions of the University of Rome, which was the people who organized the 1934, 1935, and 1936 French Montaigu conferences of fascism for all of the international parties of fascism. And had them agree that anti-Semitism, racialism, etc., were not acceptable ideologies to hold, right? Or policy points to hold, rather. But religion has always been sort of a do it as you please, right? Mussolini firmly believed that religion should be separate from the state. And I hold that opinion myself, despite being Roman Catholic, is that the religion should be a separate entity, because I believe independently the religion, the church, can do more good on its own, especially around the world. With its humanitarian works, I don't believe that it should be ever tied to any one state. I don't find that fair. Though there will be fascist disagree. For example, in Austria and Romania, there was different levels of religious fascism where they incorporated aspects of their religion, but that made sense to them because their population was almost exclusively the Roman Catholic or Romanian Orthodox. So it made sense to appeal to the religious values, especially in that time era where religion was making a mass comeback after the fate of World War I. Right, so Austria and Romania were exceptions to the rule of fascism being a generally secular ideology because it made sense to appeal to the religion connected to fascism rather than leave them independent. Right.
Yeah, of course. So let's talk about Europe, because I think we've talked about this before on some occasions. Europe and generally Western Europeans, I think, especially, tend to view fascism more in the light of which you are presenting it. Why is that? And could you explain kind of maybe the differences between that and maybe
Sure.
Western society generally?
Yeah, in nations that previously had fascists who weren't toppled by foreign invasion, of course, with some exceptions such as Slovakia, you see that fascism has a general accepting view. Like if you look at Spain, the Falang, the Fête de la Jones, etc., all these groups of fascists have decent relations with the people around them and are pretty well accepted. Of course, there's still the average anti-fascist ranting and whatnot, but they're all based on the acceptance that fascism is not a racialist ideal, it's not anti-Semitic, etc. Which is why fascism in these countries has made such a prominent comeback. Look at Italy. Even now, Italy is having this battle within itself about defining fascism, right? Because it's become a difficult situation to broach because they did violently overthrow Mussolini, or the Western powers did, but the means by which this violence was achieved was entirely foreign. So the peoples of Italy still feel a remarkable connection to their Mussolini past, right? The Mussolini field past, the fascist past. And in Slovakia, it's similar. They were overthrown by a foreign invasion, and thus they have 14 members of an open fascist party having been elected to the seats there. And that mentality was unaffected by the Western propaganda, which effectively worked much better in America, in Britain, Canada, I don't know, Australia, New Zealand, etc., where they were more removed from the effects of fascism, right? They weren't able to see firsthand what fascism could be like, and instead had to rely on secondhand and third-hand messaging.
Can I get a quick free Palestine in the chat?
Anyway, but continuing on. So let's talk about. Let's see here. What's my next question on here? Before we talk about the difference between nationalism and. Actually, would you consider fascism to be considered an ultra-nationalistic ideology?
Well, no. Both fascism and nationalism / ultranationalism regard the state as the foundation of all rights and the source of values in an individual composing it. For one as the other, the state is not a consequence of principle. However, in the case of nationalism, the relation which individualistic liberalism and for so that socialism also assume to be between the individual and the state is inverted, right? Since the state is the principle, the individual becomes a consequence. He is something which finds an antecedent in the state. The state limits him and determines him in a manner of existence, restricting his freedom, binding him to a piece of ground whereon he was born, and he must live on, and he must die. Right? That's the nationalist view. In the case of fascism, the state and the individual are the same thing. Right? It's such a relationship that they are, in fact, the exact same thing. Or rather, they're inseparable in terms of necessary synthesis, right? Nationalism founds the state on the conception of a nation being an entity of blood or soil or whatever, right? Which transcends the well of life of the individual because it is conceived as objectively having always existed, apart from the consciousness of the individuals. It is a fact, right? The state to a nationalist is a fact. To the fascist, it is not. It is a popular sovereign thing. It's a mobile, ever-changing event. Even if the individual does not want it to exist. For the nationalist, the nation exists not by virtue of the citizen's will, but as a fact, as I just said. Fascism is on the contrary. The state is a wholly spiritual curation. It is a national state because, from the fascist point of view, the nation itself is a creation of mind. It is not a material presupposition. It is not a datum of nature. A nation, says the fascist, is never really made, neither therefore can the state obtain its absolute form, since it is merely the nation that latter's concrete, political manifestation. For the fascist, the state is always in fiat, it's always in our hands, wholly, whence our very serious responsibility towards it, right? However, the state of the fascist is curated by the consciousness and the will of the citizen. There's not a force descending on the citizen from above or from without, right? It cannot have towards the massive population relationship, which is presumed by nationalism. It can't be like you only exist because we want you to. Right? The nationalism has always identified the state with the nation. The fascist sees it completely different. It's a people state, which it's a democratic state par excellence, if you want to be real here. Right? The relationship between the state and the citizen, not one citizen, this citizen, or that citizen, all citizens, is according so intimate that the state only exists in and as so far as the citizen causes it to exist. Its formation is therefore the formation of a consciousness of individuals in the masses. It cannot be easily marked down to one thing or the other. That is the fascist understanding of state. That is the fascist conceptualization of state. That is where the massive place where we differentiate from ultra-nationalists, from the nationalists, from the Nazi, etc., who see the state as having always existed, seeing the race as having always existed, and thus the state where the nation is a means of blood, is a means of soil, and so forth. The fascist does not agree with that. The fascist says that is incorrect. The state is the people, and only extends so far as the people do.
Okay, fantastic. So let's talk about first off. Let's talk about Seamusite fascism. Then we'll get into economics after that.
Sure.
So, How did you come to fascism? And I guess we'll go to from your political journey and how you've kind of developed, and then talk about how you came to Seamusite fascism and how you've kind of grown that movement.
Sure. So, years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, I was a member of the Irish Socialist Party. It was a Trotskyite party. It's the first party I ever voted for, the first party I ever paid memberships to, right? I was a socialist. Um, Firmly a socialist, in fact. I firmly believe that socialism had always been a good idea. But over time, with education, went to university and so forth, I learned that socialism was in fact not the goal. It was not a good thing. It was in fact a how do you say a drain. Right? It sucked the life out of a people. It drained them through labor, through the nationalization of all means, the top-down planned economy. It drained them of everything they had and left them an empty carcass. The state it inhabited died along with them. And as I read more, I felt that only a power of absolute, only a power of actual meaning, of popular sovereignty, as Hobbes explains, can exist. Right? Only by the means of popular sovereignty. As Nietzsche said, God is dead. God is politically dead. You cannot use God to justify rights. You cannot use God to justify authority. All you can do is justify authority by other means. So the fascist was curated, right? Giovanni Gentile realized that, Hegel realized that, and he had to curate an ideology, a philosophy that did not require God. Post-God, if you want to call it, right? So the fascist had to curate a means of authority that was better, or not really better per se, but a effective replacement for what God was to the pre-Enlightenment or pre-Renaissance people, right? Which is an absolute, and that is the people, the state, the sovereign, the conscious, right? People want to be led. That is a simple fact of history, right? People want leadership. They need security. They need leadership, and that leadership is delivered by fascism. And I figured that out 4 years ago and I began researching intensively, reading everything I could. I started.
Well,
with,
actually, let's talk about your credentials. I probably should have done that at the beginning, but let's talk about your credentials. So, obviously you don't have to tell us where you went to school or anything of that nature, but just tell us, kind of generally speaking, what your education is and that sort of thing.
Okay. Well, I went to school in a university college, as they're called here in Ireland. And I entered for pre-law, basically. So I did history, psychology, philosophy, etc., all these different classes. But what really stuck with me was history, right? Of course, I aced my philosophy courses with my readings of Hegel and Hobbes. It was a hit with my professor, I could say. But history was what I really found a love for, right? So I became effectively a historian. I did a lot of work. I finished my degree there in history, and before I went into law school, which is what I'm currently going through. And that is sort of where I left off, right? That's my credentialing. I found a love, and I found a connection with the study of history, with the study of yesterday. As one man once quipped, what is it? Those who do not learn the past are doomed to repeat it.
Fantastic. Well, we actually have some questions already. So,
Maybe in the chat.
So I'll read them to you if you want. How would the immigration work under fascism? If this question was already asked, came a little bit late. It was not asked, but thank you. Fantastic. So
Okay,
how would
immigration work
Yes.
under fascism? That's a great question. In a modern day, what we would do is we would completely stop immigration right now. Bang, complete stop. No more people in, right? You can leave if you want, but no more people in. That's how it goes. Then for the next 5 years, the immigration bureaus would thus work on a system of meritocratic immigration, in which they could sort out the best ways to bring people in. And of course, we would set quotas and how many we were allowing in, and all these people. Of course, we'd only select those who are willing to, one, assimilate, two, work, and three, find a place and be content in society. So we would have a professional immigration. We would have this meritocratic system of selecting those who applied for citizenship and wanted to movement to this nation. And then we'd, of course, we put them through the assimilation. We'd put them through citizenship tests. We'd have them serve in the military, maybe things like that would bring them into the nation and give them a firm connection, right, a spiritual connection with the state. And that's the goal of the fascist immigration system. And we would try to maintain the immigration system as something small, something that doesn't need a massive expansion, right, and mass understanding, because we don't need a whole lot of people entering your country at once. It's damaging, in fact. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So we have another question as well from the YouTube chat. So what is the fascist perspective on worker ownership and independent unionization?
It's pro-unionization, massively so. In fact, the fascist has always been a very pro-union person. It has always been for the worker. It's always been for the Sorelian view on national syndicalism, which was that the workers would vote in a professional collective in order to elect a higher authority. They would elect their the representatives for the National Council of Corporations and or syndicates, as it would be called by nation, right? And that's explained best in Thomas A. Raven's The Coming Corporate State, which you can find on our library, which discusses the extensive implication of a national syndicalist organization of worker ownership, worker unionization, etc., and worker voting. That would allow a meritocratic system of voting, which would promote this kind of this close connection between the worker and the state and the people working above them, right? Because we wouldn't get rid of managers. This is about class collaboration, right? Managers would exist, but they would be people who are meritocratically skilled in the arts of leadership, right? These people wouldn't be random sons or daughters or whomever related to the big CEO, because there would no longer be a big CEO. It would be a board, a mixture of workers and managers, who would thus run the collective, or not really a collective, but the union, which would then run the industry that it had control over. We saw this implemented in Italy. We saw this implemented in Spain, Argentina, not so much in Portugal. Salazar wanted corporatism, but he didn't quite want national syndicalism, which is a shame. But he did organize unions in a very similar way. He had a national union of workers. This is why fascism had the highest wages in the world. Effectively, I would say the highest wages in the world at the time. And we'll get into that when we talk about economics.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're going to go there next. Okay, sorry. So he's actually going to ask. He actually wanted to follow up on that. He was asking specifically about was asking specifically about independent unionization outside of the state/party.
Well, the state theoretically would own every union. The union is organized separately from the state. The union is effectively a voting organization for the state. Every worker in a union would cast votes for within their union, of course, for the most capable of their group. Right? A doctor union would vote for the most capable doctor to present them on the national seat of corporations and or syndicates, whatever you want to call them, and then they would be collectivized into a group, an industry. Right? In Thomas A. Raven's, I believe he has 18 industries, so they would be grouped into the healthcare industry with healthcare workers, nurses, pharmacists, etc. And these people would all work together in order to elect a cabinet member, basically for health, right? And that's how that would work. It's well explained in The Coming Corporate State. But independent unionization, it doesn't work. I don't agree with independent unionization. I don't think a union that is privately owned is a union. I believe that then it's just exploiting the workers in order to give them a false sense of security, which is probably what we have right now, is these independent unions who exploit workers. And most often, the top class of these unions are just rich people who profit off of the fact that you work and they don't. The union dues and whatnot, which is not how it's supposed to work. It's how do you call it, a degradation of the union system, which it can only be fixed through direct national action, which is what the fascists seek to do.
Fantastic. Actually, I have something to add to that, but so I've recently watched an extended video about actually the organization of the unions in Vietnam, and it's somewhat similar to what you said. The union itself or the national union itself, which is made up of smaller federal unions and other stuff of that nature. But generally speaking, it is a more, what is it called? It is a more decentral system sometimes. But generally speaking, it's an interesting system. But the whole thing is that it is inherently within the governmental system. It is built into the system and thus cannot be taken away and thus cannot be suppressed or oppressed. Just something I wanted to add. If you want to watch that video, I think I can link it in here at the end because that was actually a very interesting video on the Vietnam union systems. Just in addition, because I just thought of that. So let's talk about economics. Let's talk about the structure of economics. So what is the fascist structure of economics? Are you capitalist? Are you socialist? What do you?
Well, we're an in between. We're what's called corporatist, right? And that is a general understanding of the in between.
Wait, I'm gonna interrupt you right here. So there's a difference between corporatism and corporatocracy. They're two very different things. Corporatocracy, I'm gonna get the definitions out here, just because this is gonna be a thing. Because if I don't cover it right now, because this is always a thing I hear often. Corporatism is the control of a state or organization by large interest groups. Would you agree with that?
I believe it's the way it's described there is more construed towards actual corporations, but yeah, effectively it's the control of the means of the state by large industrial or generally just groups that could be called syndicates, could be called corporations, etc.
Fantastic. Okay, so a corporatocracy is a difference. It is a society or system that is governed or controlled by corporations. It's
implies private ownership of these corporations.
Yeah, exactly, and it implies private ownership and whatnot. Just wanted to get that out there. That's very important because it's often misrepresented, and oftentimes people use the wrong word and stuff. It is very much two entirely separate and different systems. Continue. Sorry.
So in the corporatist system, we apply Hegelian dialectics, or just dialectics in general. Hegel's the one who refined it, though he never actually claimed it. I believe it was Kant who came up with the actual dialectical system. Basically, there is a thesis, an issue. We're going to call that capitalism, right? And then there is a antithesis, which is the reaction. We'll call that socialism, right? The social capital divide. And then at the end, according to this dialectic process, would be the synthesis, the solution of both sides, which is corporatism. How that works is it's a fusion of the best ideas of socialism, that being its care for the people and its extensive nationalization of the utilities, with the best of capitalism, which is the incentivization of the free market, right? So what happens in a corporate system is there is a completely national market, only within that country, right? Of which investors may spend money in order to open business and so forth. However, there's still a free market within that, right? Of course, in that nation, there's no external investment, there's no investing externally. All money in that system is completely invested within the state, right? That thus comes the famous Mussolini statement: "All within the state, all for the state, nothing against the state," right? Which is a quote about economics, as well as, of course, the system of government he wished to establish. Now, corporatism goes further, and it progresses with this. Fascism goes further than just the corporatist aspect. It goes further. It wants this mercantilist, autocratic system where you completely cut off the outside trade to form a self-sufficient nation upon the basis of corporatism, called autarky, right? So it works into that direction to curate this autarky, this self-sustainable, and no longer requires external need, like help and assistance, in order to run its economic means. Now, this is basically explained in the Economics of Fascism by Paul Edzig. This is an authoritative source. He was not a fascist. He was an external investigator looking into the economics of Italy. So he talks about it as a solid system which allowed the wages of Italian workers to match massively, overwhelmingly, in fact, against the Western nations. Let's compare wages, right? In 1938, the average wage of an American was 25 cents per hour, right? That was the average wage, 25 cents USD per hour. In Italy, it was $2.33 USD per hour. That is a massive gap of pay between the two. That is a massive gap. That shows the mentality of the Italian state and the ability of the Italian state as an autarky to supply its citizens. And of course, we can compare the things. According to Paul Edzig, as well as others, such as the Economics of Fascism and even Mussolini versus Jefferson by Years of Pound, they explained that fascism had no income tax, right? No income tax. It had no property tax, right? No property tax. The reason why this was is because the fascists didn't believe in taxing either. Both were the essential things of man, the essential things of ownership, of freedom, right? That you would own both land and you would own your paycheck at the end of the day. But there was other ways. There was indirect taxation, of course. There was levies, of which the state, if in an extreme time of need, would ask you to donate money towards the state. All of these were voluntary systems, except for, of course, the indirect tax, things like sales tax, tariffs, etc. These are the ways. But you may ask, how does fascism come with the money to pay for all of these amazing things it has, all these systems, healthcare, free education, all these things? How does fascism pay for it if it doesn't have massive taxes like a socialist state would, where all of your paycheck is basically given back to the state? Well, the answer is quite simply is that fascism, instead of so in the modern world right now in the capitalist system, when you go to work, your excess labor is collected by the quote unquote bourgeoisie, right? The capitalist class. The people who own the business collect your excess labor, whatever value that may be. I think it's best explained. You make a broom worth $6. You're paid $3 for it. They sell it for $3, right? They made $3 off of you. Whatever it be, things like that, right? And that excess value, rather than being used to stuff the pockets of the rich in the fascist system, is used solely and only to better the people of the fascist system, right? Because that money goes directly into the treasury, goes directly into the spending, it goes directly into the products and things that the fascist state has been implementing. Things like the Gentile reforms, which I have on that we just added to our library, which explains the massive free education scheme that Gentile set up in 1923, the only of its kind, in fact, where you could go from kindergarten all the way to university without paying a fucking cent, not a dollar. You could go from kindergarten to university and whatever you were good at. If you were an artist, you went to university for art. If you were for a mathematician, you went to university for math, etc. All these things completely free start to finish. It was a great system. And in fact, it was the model, or supposed to be the model of the post-war system for Italian education, but it was never adopted due to its fascist sentiments. And the goal of Giovanni Gentile with the Gentile reforms was curating a population of well-educated people able to continue the fascist state in the absence of Mussolini and the other initial intellectuals of the fascist state, which is why it's important that we cover that in the economic segment here.
Fantastic.
Sorry.
Are you gonna? Do you have any more? Because there was another question. If you were gonna.
Yeah, we can answer the question.
Fantastic. Well, first off, he added off to the union thing, but I'm gonna go to the second question first. Well, should I go to the union thing, or do you want to?
Well, I think this is more of a comment on the CNT and IWW.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Fantastic. So I guess we'll go on to the next question. How would fascists protect political dissidents from state repression if it would?
Absolutely does. I already talked about this a little bit earlier if you go back to when I'm talking about Bordinga and the Orva, but basically the effect is that it was what is called this kind of work, right? It was done. The political dissidents are promoted in cases, especially like Nikolai Bombisi, who was an open communist, but he was well favored by Mussolini due to his agreement on the policy of being a national state, right? And they need to protect the nation first and foremost. So his critiques were always accepted by Mussolini. In fact, Mussolini continued debating them in the Senate until the 1943, before he was arrested. There are speeches of Mussolini going in the Senate trying to pass like mediocre bills about fucking which farms can open in which parts of the year, which is ludicrous, right? You would think that such a powerful dictator wouldn't need to argue with his senators on the Senate floor about such menial things, but he absolutely did, and he cared deeply about everybody around him. So when you talk about how protects people from state repression, is basically the state is never built to be a repressive entity. Like I said, the state is built as a popular entity. It is completely by the people, right? It is a popular sovereignty. I already explained all this. If you go back and rewatch, you might hear it again, might refresh yourself. Next question: if fascism is so popular among the masses, how come Salazar outlawed the largest political opposition in Portugal?
Wait, before you get to that, wait, I had something before. You talked about what did you just talk about? You just talked about
Political dissidents.
Political dissidents. I thought I had something about that. Oh yes. Oh, I wanted to talk about because this is often talked about because you kind of mentioned it already, but we haven't really talked about it specifically. We didn't really talk about how Mussolini was not necessarily entirely a dictator or really a dictator of any sort. Let's talk about that a little bit before we get into the next question, because I think that's a very important point and a very important thing to go into.
Cadrano says in his Everything for My Legionnaires, he states, fascism is not a dictatorship. It is a popular sovereignty. But at the same time, it is not a democracy. There's a good reason for this. We're not a democracy. Absolutely not. We completely reject the ideals of democracy because they are They're stupid. I mean,
Well,
I
no,
can go on.
well, are you talking about like pure democracy, or are you talking about Athenian
I'm
democracy?
talking
What do you
about
specifically?
I'm talking about democracy, the idea of voting for your elite, right? This system is different in fascism. You don't vote for the elite, you vote for your representatives who select people who are best to lead. When you go to buy bread, you expect that your baker is good at making bread. When you buy shoes, you expect your cobbler to make good shoes. When you buy a plow, when you go and talk to a farmer, when you step onto a fucking streetcar, you expect the people running these jobs to know what they're doing, right? Am I right here?
Mm-hmm.
These are specialties. So why then is there no need for any specialization when it comes to the most demanding leadership, that of a nation? Does not one have to possess certain qualities? That is what Quadranu says, and that is absolute fact, indisputable fact. People need to
Fantastic.
possess
Oh,
certain
sorry.
qualities to lead, right? Now, I'm going to comment on his
Let's get
statement.
the first one, and then we'll go to the second one.
They're both connected. Why did Salazar outlaw the MUD? This is a good question, and it ties right into the second question he asked. Then the reason why there's only one legal party and one legal organization is quite simple. Fascism believes earnestly that in order to create the most diverse acceptance of ideals, it needs to incorporate every party into it. Now, the PNF, much like the National Unification Party, which is what Salazar called his party, believed in that earnest opinion that everything they had to do had to be, all the parties had to be united in one. No more political parties because they were all just going to bicker and fight over minor policy things and oppose each other. Mosley also talks about this. I can quote him later. But basically, why these were quote unquote outlawed was because they were pointless. They were absolutely pointless. In the fascist state, there doesn't need to be an opposition party. The opposition is rolled into the fascist party so they can have a true discussion, true opposition within the system of control. Right? In the fascist party, the end goal is that the fascist party can also dissolve itself, and this can run as the corporate state, a complete entity without political parties. That is the end goal. Right? We completely remove the political parties from the system. And that's where it goes towards. That's why it comes down to one party, and then the one party slowly breaks down into no parties. That's the end goal. That's the end.
Fantastic.
Why was ND? Why were all the other legal parties natively outlawed? Because they had to be. They were all rolled into the PNF. They were all rolled into the National Unity Party. And if you go and look at these parties, Nikolai Bombishi was a member of the PNF. He was a communist. He was never a fascist. He was never a fascist. He was a staunch communist to the day he fucking died. His last words were, "Long live socialism, long live Mussolini," and then he was gunned down by anarchists. Okay, so he believed earnestly to his very last that he was establishing communism. Right? He thought that, well, whatever, I'll have to wait out Mussolini, or I'll help Mussolini in order to secure the future of the proletariat. Right? So
Fantastic. Sorry.
when we look at legal political parties in the fascist state, you can't just go, well, there was no other parties, thus it was bad. No, the parties were rolled into the PNF. They were curated as one in order to make this transition from liberal democracy and liberal state into the corporate state.
Fantastic. Actually, this is actually a little bit related. Well, it's quite a bit related. That's kind of my my whole kind of goal with my coalition, or my league, if you will, or my vanguard, if you really want to be special. And actually, I think we've talked about that before, but I don't think we went that in depth with it. And I do quite like that. I do think there should be a more of a unitary body, especially considering that most of these things, and I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant on liberal democracy, cannot really change the system within their in, while being constantly pushed against each other and constantly fracturing, despite having so many similarities, wanting workers' rights, wanting political freedom, wanting all these systems. And you've often called my system, I believe, what is it called? You've called it Seamusite Fascism but less, or something?
Yeah.
Or something of that nature. Less authoritarian, maybe. Because I think I value more flexibility within a system than maybe fascism does necessarily. So it is a little bit based off of fascism. It's often I have my economics off of autarky. I've talked about this before, where I've said to be voluntary, for society to be voluntary, you have to allow for the ability to not have to participate in a system. It's called positive liberty. It's opposed to negative liberty and whatnot. And that essentially means being ability to not to do something, or the ability to not do something. That sort of thing is what would be considered positive liberty. And the ability to be isolationist, or the ability of self-efficiency, which is a Juchean and fascist ideal. I've been studying Juche a little bit because it's interesting. And especially the philosophy, it's fantastic. I like it. But obviously, some issues with it. But that idea of being isolationist, so there you can therein allow your citizens or your populace to therein be globalist and allowing people to have that sort of voluntary association where they're not inherently needed to necessarily participate in a system that maybe they don't even agree with. That's kind of how I've adapted to Tarkin into my own system, because I don't necessarily believe in anti-globalism. I'm very globalistic, and I think that we need to work together as a globe. But at the moment, I think that it is very important to be self-sustainable, to be efficient with ourselves, especially with China on the rise and all this other stuff that we cannot necessarily control, because we don't have the control over our economy. We have to rely on others. We have to rely on an inefficient and ineffective market that clearly does not care about our particular nation. We must care about the people of our nation. It is a community. It is something that I value very, very strongly. And to have our own communities and to have our diversity, especially ideological diversity, is something that's very important to me. That's kind of why I've adapted, not necessarily fascism, but a lot of fascism and a lot of different ideology, anarchism, a lot of different other philosophy, communitarianism as ethics and principle and philosophy. It's kind of what I've gone on and changed some of this stuff that I've believed in the past. Before I met Seamus, actually. So tell the story of how I don't know how we met, but it doesn't really matter. So we debated for quite a while. We debated for, I think, an hour or two at some points, and we would continue to talk, because I was an anarchist without adjectives at one point. I was a mutualist at one point. I think for most of the time I knew you, I was an anarchist without adjectives. And we kind of talked about authority. We talked about a lot of different things, and I kind of developed my ideology out of this, and the fact that I've already studied ideologies and that sort out of my notebooks and whatnot. If you know me, you'll know about my notebooks and my extensive studying of ideology and whatnot. But that's kind of how me and Seamus came about and met each other. But we since then we talk and we discuss things, we debate, we argue and whatnot and what sorts. Usually ends up with him since he has more knowledge and a little bit more experience. He tends to be has the upper hand in that kind of thing. But yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Back on topic. Back on.
I can't hear you. You cut out
Said
there.
back on topic.
Okay, yeah, back on topic. So let's talk more about. So do you have any more questions? Where were we at exactly?
We were talking about economics, but
Yes,
I was
yes,
boiling
yes.
down to some major points here.
That's-
The fascist economical platform has always been that of a pragmatist, but we do have solid ideas. The nationalization of key industries, the utilities, transportations, healthcares, etc. The privatization of the unnecessary. We don't need to own every factory, but the ones that fail need national interference. Simple as that. And there's things like that curate nationalism, fascism's ability to be there when most states wouldn't be able to. Right, a top-down state runs into something called the economic calculation problem, the ECP. Right, so when you have an absolute state run from the top down, a planned economy, it is unable, mathematically at least, to run for an extended period of time. That's why the fascists choose the semi-planned economy, which incorporates the best of the both worlds, both the ability for capitalism to consistently run despite its economic downfalls, and the ability of socialism to give care to the people, and of course to accelerate the nation's ability to construct and to expand its inwards industry.
Fantastic. Sorry. So actually, let's talk a little bit about capitalism. What is the and markets, generally speaking? Because I always, and something I've come to recently is argue that markets are unethical because of how a very bipolar system of markets up and downs, crashes and burning of markets especially, affects a nation and affects the mental health and the mental I guess there's a sort of fragility to a system or into peoples who have to be subjugated to such a uncontrollable or such a I guess I would say wild system. So what is your thoughts kind of on that kind of take, I guess?
On capitalism being wild and unpredictable?
Yes. What is more so? What is the fascist point of view on that sort of thing?
Well, the fascist sees capitalism as both damaging to the worker, right, to the people who live under it, due to its belief that you should only make money if either you were born into a rich family or you were one in a million to somehow climb out of the indignity of being in the extreme poor, right? And fascism doesn't believe in there being extreme poor or extreme rich. What it believes is an
Wait.
extensive.
I want to talk about that actually. So how would it stop the extreme rich from existing?
Well, there would be nationalization. There would be interference, right? Banks would be nationalized and centralized. People with excess wealth, people who are unnecessarily wealthy, would have their assets redistributed, which happened quite a bit in Italy, happened in Spain, happened in Portugal, happened in Austria, etc., etc. It happened because these people were threats to the ability of some to live. Rivera writes it most plainly that there should, in no case, be people who live in grand splendor while anyone lives in extreme poverty. There should be no, 9 mansions with a helicopter or two and a few yachts when the person down the street could be starving, right? That's not the kind of mindset that would be built. And in fact, I had to talk with a couple of guys and a couple of Americans recently, and they were like, "What would the first thing fascism would do in America?" And I said, "Well, they'd kick in the door of almost every mansion in the United States, wouldn't they? And they would take those assets, right? They would seize those assets. The big companies, things like Apple and whatnot, they would see their assets seized because they are monopolies. They are complete control. Disney, Apple, big oil companies, etc., would see their means seized because they have been monopolized. They have taken over what effectively should be a either completely devolved and balkanized or cannibalized system of local businesses, or should be run efficiently by the state or its corporations and syndicates thereunder, right? Rather than run by private interests who don't have any connection to the nation at large. The ultra rich will never be connected to the nation. They will always be an international citizen because they feel that their wealth is what attributes them to wherever. They will move wherever it takes to make money, wherever it takes. I mean, I'm pretty sure fucking SodaStream has a factory in the middle of a Israeli settlement in Palestine, like one of those, like on the Gaza Strip, one of those Israeli exclaves. They have a soda headquarters there, which is extreme. Like, why would you ever want to set one up there? Your headquarters there, it's stupid. But they do it because there's tax benefits, right? There's all these bonuses to setting things up there, and that's the kind of system that the ultra rich will engage in. They will move wherever the money is, and that's the plain fact of international capitalism and international finance and why it needs to be destroyed.
Okay, so let's actually get into that a little bit more. So how do you stop these people from leaving? Because like you said before, they will always want to go where it is most effective, it is most economically, I guess, helping them, I guess. I mean, exactly, profitable.
What you do is you take it away from them before they can. Like I said, the first thing the fascists would do would be taking all those things, the nationalization of those things. It would happen immediately. They would seize everything. I think I used a bit more colorful imagery. I think I said you would see black shirts, NSVN or whatever you want to call them, kicking in the doors of the headquarters around the nations and seizing the people, the ultra rich, and ensuring that they cannot flee, that they see their assets distributed properly. Because in Mussolini's day, it was much harder to get out of the country, right? It was much harder to flee. So Mussolini had the luxury of waiting a few months or even years
So
before he actually
so
started
you
redistributing
probably
lands because people couldn't immediately flee. They needed to get their assets in order. They needed to move money out of the country, etc. Right? In a lot of
correct.
cases, they needed to move physical items. So Mussolini had the luxury of time. We do not have the luxury of time. The first thing, the most important thing we had to do was shut down all transactions out of his country, right? We nationalize the assets of the ultra rich and ensure that it's redistributed fairly to the citizenry, and we would need to see that happen immediately, very quickly. And I doubt there's any fascists that would disagree with that kind of idealistic fix to the current wealth disparity. I mean, no, any fascist that, of course, has read theory and studied praxis at least.
Fantastic. Actually, let's go into a little bit of that because there's a lot of people who claim to be fascists. There's a lot of people who claim to support fascism. That, and especially on the online sphere, you see that a lot where people will claim to be that, and then they will speak or present their ideas a lot differently than you expect someone of that caliber to present their ideas, or someone who has studied praxis or theory and understand fascism to a significant extent. What do you think say to people who may act like Nazis but call themselves fascists? How do you solve that issue? Because it's a very common issue.
Well, you confront them, right? You immediately confront them. That's what I do, right? When I meet these people who claim to be fascists or claim to represent fascism, I confront them and I ask them questions. I try to get them to answer things honestly because they believe earnestly in this idea that somehow fascism. I mean, a lot of them believe that fascism is like this racialist agenda that hates blacks and Jews and whatnot. And then there's others who believe that fascism is just like this capitalistic state because they believe the Western propaganda. They are the people who, despite hearing the Western propaganda that it was bad, believe that that bad was actually good because they act in support of it, which is almost as bad as saying that it's bad in the first place. Those are the type of people who are initially attracted to fascism. That's the type of people we reject, the people we exclude from the ideology because they're a poison, they're a cancer. I believe it's one of the first lines in the National Reformation Party of America, which is the fascist party in America right now. I'll grab it right here. Their first line in the membership section is the NRP is adamantly opposed to National Socialism and white nationalism. If you're adherent to either of these doctrines, your presence will not be welcome, and the cause will you will cause be caused. Jesus Christ, you will be cause for immediate expulsion from the party, which is the same line that Mosley took too. He banished anti-Semites and racists from his parties, and I have the letters to prove that he did. I could read them off if you want, where they talk extensively about how racism and anti-Semitism are not welcome within the union movement, are not welcome within the fascist ideals. It's quite simple.
Fantastic. So, well, I think we're coming a little bit too close here. So I'm gonna give a few more questions. And I can let you take a few statements off. So, we're returning to the markets and the idea of a market and whatnot. So something that came to me just now was oftentimes, and I hate to run into these kind of people, but anarcho-capitalists tend to argue that free market. What do you say to people who argue for the free reign of markets and that should be a goal or something a nation should strive for?
Well, I feel that they're disconnected from the reality of the economic situation. A free market will always be inherently damaging to the people that live under it, right? Because it will only seek for its own personal gain. And it drives this sort of wedge, this kind of idea, philosophy into the minds of people that it's okay as long as you made money off of it. It's okay if you sold your morals out, if you abandoned your points, your basic human morality, as long as you made money, as long as you made a living off of doing it, right? It builds this kind of acceptance that being a bad person is excusable if it was all you could do in a situation, or this is how you made your money, etc. Because they accept that. They accept that this is somehow an acceptable behavior, an acceptable outcome. It's not. It's simply not. And the people who believe that a free market, if left to its own, will work are delusional. They refuse to accept that the reality is people will conglomerate it. People will make monopolies. People will oppress one another, will exploit one another, and lead to inevitable suffering amongst the vast majority of people. And that's the reality of capitalism. And in fact, Mussolini stated at one point, corporatism overcomes socialism and overcomes liberal capitalism. It creates a new synthesis. One fact is symptomatic, a fact which perhaps has not been sufficiently reflected upon. The decline of capitalism coincides with the decline of socialism. All the socialist parties of Europe are being shattered. I'm not talking about Italy. I'm also talking about in other countries. Obviously, the two phenomena, I will not say they were conditioned from a strictly logical point of view. However, there was among them a simultaneity of historical order. This is why the corporate economy rises in a determined historical moment. The two constituent phenomena, capitalism and socialism, have already given everything they could give, and they failed. That is why fascism honestly came about in an economic ideal. It's because both had failed the people of Italy, had failed the people of Europe, had failed everything.
Fantastic. So, and you know me quite well. I go into into complaining about liberal democracy and liberalism quite a lot. Created a little bit of a thing about it. So, why do you think that liberal democracy has been so successful, especially with creating a system that insists upon itself? And this is sort of like a my personal question, not necessarily personal question, but related to my kind of ideology and that sort of thing. So why do you think that system is so good at insisting upon itself, and then from therein allowing that system to almost that ideology to not necessarily dissolve, but just kind of melt into the background or depoliticize? What is your take on that?
Sorry, can you restate the question? You got a bit lost there at the end.
Yeah, I kind of became redundant. So liberal democracy sort of insists upon itself. Why do you think it's been so successful with kind of creating a monopoly on politics, if you will.
Well, it's done that because of the extensive propaganda we've done for it. We have sold ourselves that socialism is bad, but fascism is indefinitely worse, and that any kind of opposition to the liberal to the control of the liberal state is somehow an attack against your freedom, against your liberty, because you've been brainwashed. You've been so extensively told the only means of freedom, the only means of connection that you have to any kind of real outside world is that this is the only way you can live, right? This is the best way to live. Churchill said, "Oh, democracy's the worst. It's just better than all the other ones we've tried," which is redundant. This kind of ideal that liberal democracy is a good or moral idea is just completely ridiculous. It rejects the fundamental basics of any society to attract itself to authority, to attract itself to people who can lead, and it kind of rejects that in favor of this immoral societal collapse. And I mean, it was once said by Aristotle that tolerance was the virtue of a dying society, and that's the reality of liberal democracy. It will tolerate itself to the very ends of the earth and eventually dissolve itself. And what we'll be left with is true anarchy, not a political anarchy, but in which there is no government, there is no state, there's no means of connection, and we'll be left with, as Hobbes described, the state of nature, a life brutish, hellish, and short, filled with nothing but pain and suffering.
Alrighty, okay, so I think we've pretty much wrapped this up. If you have any other points to make, or anything you missed, or anything that is very important, do you have any?
I think we covered it all.
Okay, fantastic. Fantastic. Let me just pretend I had the music ready for the outro. Well, that goes for this this episode of the Backtrack podcast. This one is 1 second. Actually, I have to open this in my fucking thing. This goes for the episode of the Backtrack podcast. This has been Seamus, and I think I don't think I put his YouTube channel in the description.
Okay.
I'll do that.
It's all connected to our.
It's all connected. So I'll see you guys later.
March on in the
just because he's human, a man would like a little bite to eat. He wants no bull and a lot of talk that gives no bread and meat.
so left 2, 3, so left 2, 3 to the work that we must do. March on in the Workers' United Front, for you are a worker too. And just because he's human, he doesn't like a pistol to his head. He wants no servant under him and no boss overhead. So left 2, 3 three, so left to three, to the work that we must do. March on in the workers' united front, for you are a worker too. And just because he's a worker, his job is all his own. Three, so left to three, to the work that we must do. March on